Welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament. And we are picking up where we left off in our conversation about 2 weeks ago now, talking about the book of Judges and the situation that was taking place in that period of Israel's history. And we found very quickly in that conversation about Judges that that was a pretty chaotic time in Israel's history. It was not a time of peace and prosperity, although they had times of peace during that book, of course, but we found that that was not really the common situation. The common situation was complete chaos and uncertainty. You have different nations invading Israel and seizing territory that did not belong to them, in this constant back and forth battle between the Israelites and the various nations that surrounded them, and a lot of it centering in on their disobedience and their failure to understand the Lord and what He wanted from them. And there's so many different issues that we could talk about relevant to that point, but I think we get the idea that Judges was not a good time in Israel's history. But as with any period of history, it was not forever, it was not to last. And there was something in the future that was better than what they had been enduring at that time and even in the past. And so by the time we come into the book of 1 Samuel, which is right after the book of Judges, of course, right after Ruth there, which occurred in the time of the Judges, we find that in 1 Samuel it is named after the last judge in Israel, whose name was Samuel, who was also one of the first prophets that they had, at least as far as prophets being the way they were in the Old Testament. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail as we go on through our study here, but nevertheless, understand that Samuel represents the last of that class of people as a judge. But the story of Saul, which is the focus of our conversation today, in many respects begins with Samuel. You can't really understand how Saul came to power as king, or really even how the kingdom formed, without really understanding who Samuel is and how he played an integral part in all of that conversation. And so to understand Samuel, we have to just take a slight step back to look at maybe the first couple of chapters and just summarize what takes place in those chapters. So if you go back to 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2, you find there that his mother, Samuel's mother, that is Hannah, was barren. And she wanted to have a child. She was desperate to that end, and she prays to God, and He grants her that request. He does allow her to have a child by the name of Samuel, and she dedicates Samuel to the Lord all the days of his life. And what that basically translated to was that when Samuel was born and he was of age, he was able to go to the tabernacle and then work with Eli and the other priests that were there to be trained by them and to serve in that special way as a Levite before God. He was not a son of Aaron necessarily, so he would not take on that responsibility, but he would still be able to serve in a lot of areas that God had desired. And this was something that was good and something that showed Hannah fulfilling her promise to God after he fulfilled his promise to her. So all that is to say that Samuel already has an interesting start. He already has a great start in terms of his mother having a faithful heart toward God, having a desire to serve him, and having a desire to dedicate Samuel to God's service. The trouble was that who Samuel was there with, Eli, and Eli's sons, they were not really the men they should have been. So Eli was himself a judge, and he was also the high priest in Israel at that time, but he was not worth much. And the scripture does not depict him nor his sons as worth much. They took advantage of the Israelites. They did not carry out their responsibilities as priests. They really saw the leadership as something that benefited them rather than something that was to serve others. And that's always been an issue even into our own day today. But nevertheless, we find that Samuel is raised up in that type of setting, and we find also that God was able to use him to, in many respects, undo some of the problems they had been experiencing during the time of Eli and his two sons, who, in short order in the book of 1 Samuel, are going to depart from this life and move on from there because of their disobedience and their sinfulness. But that brings us then to Samuel, who, again, was raised up in the tabernacle in that environment, was empowered by God to overcome a lot of obstacles. And we're going to find that God uses Samuel not only as a judge, but really as someone who is going to guide the nation through a great time of transition. So there's a lot of emphasis put on who Samuel is and how great he was before God, not necessarily because he really was in and of himself that great, but because of how God was able to use him due to his humility. So I want us to do some reading here in 1 Samuel to understand a bit more about Samuel and his situation and who he was as a person. So we're going to turn our attention first and foremost to 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 14. And I'm going to invite you to join me there in that reading of 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 14. And in 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 14, we find the testimony written as this. So the children of Israel said to Samuel, "Do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines." And Samuel took a suckling lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. Then Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. Now as Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. But the Lord thundered with a loud thunder upon the Philistines that day, and so confused them that they were overcome before Israel. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, and drove them back as far as below Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and called its name Ebenezer, saying, Thus far the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued, and they did not come any more into the territory of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. Then the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron to Gath, and Israel recovered its territory from the hands of the Philistines. Also there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Now obviously there's a lot that we could break down in this text, but did you notice some of the details that are mentioned here regarding Samuel? Notice his response to a desperate situation. His response is to go directly to God. He cries out in verse 9 specifically, and the Lord answers his cry. The Lord delivers Israel from the Philistines. Look at verse 10. So Samuel offers a burnt offering, he cries out to God, and then look what happens. The Lord thunders out this loud thunder before the Philistines. He confuses them so that way they're overcome before Israel. This was something that had not happened for a long, long time. And yet here Samuel is presiding over this, not because of his own goodness, I'll mention, but because of God showing this mercy to them and using Samuel as his instrument to bring this to pass. And you see the result in verses 11 through 14. They had a victory they had not had in so long. They were able to defeat the Philistines, to subdue them, verse 13 says, to the extent the Philistines did not come any more into Israel. That's how thorough their defeat was in the days of Samuel. So you're seeing already a glimmer of hope here. This is a good thing that you're seeing in terms of the history of the Old Testament, where their ancient enemy has been subdued. They have peace once again, and they're able to make amends for what has taken place up to this point. But notice in verse 13, there's an important detail here that's going to feed right into our next point. It says at the very end of verse 13, the hand of the Lord is against the Philistines for how long? All the days of Samuel. It was not to last. It would be something that was temporary, that would revert back to what it was before after the days of Samuel were over. And we'll see that a little bit more as we go through our study here for this particular situation. So again, to understand what's taking place with Samuel, you're seeing a good start. You're seeing him do good things. You're seeing him be successful. But again, as I've already mentioned, it was not to last. Let's just go down just a few verses here into chapter 8. And I just want us to read the first 6 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 8 here, because this feeds directly into what we're describing here as far as what the problem was. So Samuel is a man. He's not going to live on earth forever. Eventually he has to lay aside his earthly life and move on. And that's precisely what you're seeing here in chapter 8. Not that he dies in chapter 8 at this point, but just saying that he was getting older, he was no longer able to do what he had been doing previously, and something had to change. So here's what chapter 8 in verses 1 through 6 tells us. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. So do you see the problem that unfolds with Samuel? So again, he was getting older. He was no longer able to judge Israel as he had in the past. So naturally, he chooses his sons to take over these responsibilities. But verse 3 makes it clear they were not fit for service. They turned aside after dishonest gain, they took bribes, and they perverted justice. Hardly the type of people you want to be serving as judges. And so here you have a situation where they were not fit to serve. Samuel was too old to serve. Something had to change. And the situation and the solution the elders of Israel came up with was a king. But not just any king, you'll notice in verse 5. What kind of king did they want? Now make us a king to judge us like what? All the nations. This is an important detail in the Old Testament. It is often said, and I've heard this taught many times, that Israel was never to have a king. Well, if you look in the law of Moses, specifically in Deuteronomy chapter 17, it's pretty clear that God had regulations for who a king would be, and that he would grant them a king. But the key detail here of why this was so displeasing to God and to Samuel, as we see there in verse 6, is the fact that the people were in effect rejecting God's leadership and rejecting who God had empowered to be a leader. And here you have a situation where they not only reject God's leadership, but they even want a leader to replace his leadership with someone who is going to be like all the nations, someone who is going to judge them as everyone else is judged. So they're not even looking at this from the right perspective. They're not even following the law to this end. They did not cry out for a king the way that God expected them to do so and regulated them to do so. They go their own direction with it. And therein lies the problem and why this is so displeasing. So again, we see with Samuel that his situation and his judgeship, you might say, is what leads in then to the kingdom coming to pass and the fact that the people wanted a king in the first place. But that detail is very key to understanding what's going to happen with Saul. They did not want a king who would judge them according to the way God would judge them, who would rule with righteousness and with truth. They wanted a king to judge them like all the nations around them. And the behavior of kings has always been unjust. The behavior of kings has always been unrighteous, unless that king was tempered and trained by the word of God, and specifically in this time frame by his law. And that's specifically what Deuteronomy chapter 17 sought to address, but that is not what they want here. So that detail is key to understanding what the problem is here in this transition from Samuel into a king, who we're going to find out very quickly is going to be King Saul. And so Samuel is presiding over this. He is displeased about this. He warns the people about this, and yet he still humbles himself before God and does what God tells him to do, because the Lord told him in verses 7 through 9 of this very chapter that he should go ahead and do what the people request, that he should appoint a king over them, and that God would guide him through that process. And that's precisely what happens. So going back to our slideshow here, we find that Israel's request to have a king really should have been a blessing for them. And again, I say that because the law itself in Deuteronomy chapter 17 indicates that. But that blessing quickly turns into a curse because of who Saul is and his lack of leadership abilities. So let's turn our attention then to who Saul is. So we understand Samuel pretty well now, but what about Saul? So there's a lot that we could break down about Saul. Obviously, we don't have all the time in the world in this discussion to go over that, but let's just summarize some high-level points about who he was and what his reign generally was characterized by. So we find that at the beginning of Saul's reign, after Samuel appoints him to be king and sends him on his way to do these things, that he starts out with a fairly good reign. He's able to defeat Ammon, for one thing, so we have that brief high point narrated in 1 Samuel chapter 11. But it's not too long after he starts reigning as king that things start taking a downhill turn. And specifically, we find that Saul was not obedient to God's commands. And it was not an isolated incident either. This happens multiple times. So in chapter 13, just to summarize what happens there without reading that text in detail, you have a situation where Samuel is about to go out to battle against the Philistines, and he was specifically told by the prophet Samuel to wait for 7 days until Samuel would arrive. He would then offer the sacrifice, and that would be the key for them to have the victory that day, and that was according to God's command. Well, as time would have it and as things would unfold, we have Saul there with the people that were commanded by him, waiting for his orders, waiting to proceed forth to confront their enemies. And Saul is waiting, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and Samuel does not appear. And so he becomes fearful. He becomes paralyzed with fear to the point that he sees no other choice but to do what Samuel was supposed to do, and that is offer the sacrifice. Well, that was a bad idea, because Samuel quickly shows up and rebukes him for this, tells him that he has transgressed God's command and has jeopardized his kingship, and that God was then seeking someone to replace him even, which put Saul on check to let him know that things were not going to go well for him from that point forward. And if that was not enough, you have then in chapter 15 another situation that unfolds that's very similar to chapter 13, but there you have God telling Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 15 verses 1 through 3 to defeat the Amalekites and to utterly destroy them as God had commanded. He said that all the way back in his law, and now he's bringing that to pass now during the reign of Saul. Well, Saul is partially obedient. He partially does what God wants him to do. He does defeat most of the Amalekites and kills most of the people there, but he does not fully carry out the command. He spares the king. He spares the best of the livestock, thinking in his mentality that this was somehow a benefit to God and that he could modify his command and therefore be justified. But once again, as we found in 1 Samuel 13, that did not prove proper for him. It did not prove profitable in his respect. It was actually to his discredit, not to his credit. And so he is once again condemned, and this time even more thoroughly, where Samuel tells Saul in no uncertain terms that his disobedience has wrested the kingdom from him, and there was no doubt now that God was going to choose someone else to serve as king and to demote Saul, as it were, out of that position because of his disobedience. And that is really the key to understanding the problem with Saul and his kingship. It wasn't necessarily any other factor except for the fact that he was not an obedient king. He was not God's representative. He was his own representative. And in those two situations, in 1 Samuel chapter 13 and 1 Samuel chapter 15, you have two different ideas that emerge about Saul that are very critical to understanding his character. You have a man who is stubborn, a man who does not want to listen to what someone has to say because he thinks of himself as better. And not only that, but he doesn't see the need to change. He's content with who he is. He doesn't see the need to do anything differently, because after all, if he's already perfect, then what else can you do with perfection? He never says that directly, but you definitely get the idea that was his mentality. But his other problem feeds directly into his stubbornness, and that was his fearfulness. He was terrified and just dreading every moment that he was possibly losing power or possibly going to be insulted or assaulted by his own people. You have a king who is just paralyzed by fear and gripped by it. He doesn't see the need for trust. And it's interesting that when you compare Saul to Samuel, the one that put Saul in place, Samuel in a similar situation, and we see in chapter 11 and also or chapter 13 and 15 rather, Samuel was in a similar situation back in chapter 7. And rather than be full of fear, he was full of trust in God, and he was able to win the day through that trust. Well, Saul didn't learn that lesson. He was gripped by fear. He refused to learn. He refused to put his trust in God, and it led to his downfall. And it produced his disobedience. So those factors all together, just going into a mixing pot, did not benefit Samuel, or did not benefit Saul, rather, in the slightest. And as time goes on now, from this point forward, after chapter 15, Saul descends further into evil and madness. His power is slipping further and further away from him. And rather than change his ways, he's going to double down on his evil ways and just continue down the same evil path that he had created for himself. That leads us now to our next slide here. We have this idea of Saul's proclamation of doom in chapter 15 that feeds directly into everything that happens after that. So we find, first of all, in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14, the Holy Spirit departs from Saul. Now, this is a pretty significant detail, because this is the demonstration and the manifestation, as it were, that God was no longer favoring Saul, and that he would no longer bless Saul in his efforts. Saul was basically on his own at this point. He was freewheeling it, as it were, as king, and that's never a position you want to be in when you're trying to lead a nation like Saul was. So he has that to his discredit. In addition to that, a troubling spirit that overcomes him, a troubling spirit that is very grievous to him and causes him a lot of problems, and yet he still doesn't see the need to do anything differently. And so as time goes on, we're going to encounter David in this situation. And David is a young man at this point. He was a shepherd boy who was then called to military service after he defeated Goliath. And because he outdid Saul, and the women sang this song about him, saying that Saul has killed his hundreds, but Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his 10,000s. Saul was infuriated by that. He could not stand that there was someone that was better than him, or someone that had outshined him in some respect. So he tries to kill David. Not just once, not just twice, but multiple times attempts to kill David and hunts him down vigorously, trying to put him to death because he deemed him to be a threat to his kingdom and to his power. Later on, we see as a direct correlation to that. In 1 Samuel chapter 22, he slaughters an entire village of priests because he thought they were disloyal to him. He thought that they were against him because they had assisted David, even though they were not even fully aware of the situation that was happening between the king and David. But yet he had them all slaughtered without any sort of remorse, without any sort of hint of problems in his own mind. He just thought this was the right thing to do because he's king, and therefore he has the right to do whatever he pleases. You find in chapter 28 in verses 3 through 15 of 1 Samuel that at the height of his disobedience, this is the culmination of his path that he had chose, he goes to a witch, or a medium, the text says, to consult her for guidance. He has her conjure up the ghost of Samuel so he can consult Samuel for guidance, and asks him and begs him, what should I do here? How do I get out of this situation? And it was only the consummation of his disobedience and his evil ways. Truly, we see in all these situations, and so many more that we could cite, Saul acted out of fear, and he acted out of desperation, and he acted out of disobedience. His kingship was about him. He truly was the embodiment of what Israel asked for, though. He really was a king like all the other nations. He did not really regard God the way that he ought to have. He didn't really care about the Lord and what he wanted from him. He only cared about what he wanted for himself and what he thought was best for himself as king. And that was always going to be a pathway bound for failure, and yet that's the pathway that Saul chose despite the many warnings he received, the many opportunities he had. It was such a tragedy that unfolded, but it was one that he chose for himself. And so we think about Saul and reflect upon his example and what we can learn from him, but then also some of the good things that may have come out of his kingship, if you could even say there's a good thing that comes out of it. But we have to learn a couple of different ideas that emerge from this. We have a situation here where Saul, because of stubbornness, because of pride, because of desperation, and because of fear, caused the Lord's kingdom to suffer in Israel, caused a lot of innocent people to suffer, and has a negative testimony to this very day about his unfaithfulness. In fact, I want you to read with me in just a moment here 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 13 through 14, to really understand just how serious this problem was with Saul. This testimony that we have here of Saul is one of the most negative you'll find in Scripture, but I believe it's important for us to read it to understand just how bad this really was and how horrible Saul's kingdom really was. So join me here in the reading of 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 13 through 14, which really is a summary of who Saul was as king and what his kingdom represented. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and also because he had consulted a medium for guidance. But he did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he killed him, and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. Now that may sound rough to us, but again, this is who Saul was. This is what he chose to be, unfaithful. He chose to not keep the word of the Lord. He chose to consult a medium for guidance. He chose these things, and therefore justice had to be administered. He had to be put out of power because he would not have resigned on his own accord, nor would he have allowed anyone else to take his place. This had to take place the way that it did because of Saul's own evil choices. And so we have this warning baked into this text and baked into our understanding of who he was as king against fear and against desperation and against disobedience. And to understand just how critical it is to put our trust in God, even when we're uncertain of what the future may hold. Even when we're unclear about exactly what needs to be done, we put our trust in God because we understand that will lead to prosperity. We see the victory of Samuel back in 1 Samuel chapter 7, how he was able to overcome a great enemy through trust in God. Just as we also see the downfall of Saul through his lack of trust in God and his lack of faithfulness to him, that also is a warning to us. So let's learn from the warnings we have in Saul. Let's make sure we don't go down the same path that he did, that's defined by stubbornness, that's defined by fear, and defined by unfaithfulness. But to instead embrace trust, and to embrace obedience, and to embrace the good things that God has given to us, and to not allow our story to become one of tragedy and missed opportunity as it was for Saul. But I mentioned just a moment ago how there was something good that came out of Saul, and that was this, that his downfall paves the way for David to ascend to power. In fact, it is Saul who actually takes David away from his shepherdship, because remember, as I've already mentioned, David was just a shepherd boy there under his father Jesse. He's out there in the field tending to sheep, but it was actually Saul, because of David's victory over Goliath, who enabled him to become a military commander and then eventually to become a great warrior and a great king over Israel, the king that God truly wanted over his people. Not a king like all the nations, but a king who would be after his own heart. That'll be the focus of our next conversation, though, so you have to stick around for the next episode to understand more about David and who he was, and how he contrasts very well with Saul, and in many respects was the exact opposite of Saul because he was trusting, he was obedient, and as a general idea, he was faithful. For right now, though, we'll call it quits at this episode. I hope this has been enlightening to you as far as Saul's reign and how disastrous it was, but also some of the things we can learn from him and his evil ways. In a negative sense, that is, so we know what not to do before God. And as always, I hope this episode has benefited you in some way, and I will see you next time for our next conversation about King David. Thank you.